Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Shay Frechette, co-owner of Frechette Winery and chair of the Regional Chambers Board of Directors. Thank you so much for attending day 2 of the 2021 Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. When the first Tri-Cities Diversity Summit took place 4 years ago, the intent was to create open, meaningful dialogue about issues that affect businesses and residents in this region. And due to the COVID pandemic, we're presenting this event virtually for the second year. And although we're not gathering in person to have these conversations with each other, our hope is that everyone watching these sessions this week will find opportunities to have open, meaningful dialogue with their workplace, their peer groups, and their friends. This year's Tri-Cities Diversity Summit features 4 listening sessions, a keynote presentation, and the announcement of the 2021 Tri-Cities Champion of Diversity Award recipients. Today's first session will feature an informative workshop focused on the features of an effective DEI toolkit for your business. The next session will begin promptly at 11:15, and it will be an engaging CEO roundtable with 4 CEOs from our community. Before we begin this morning's session, I'd like to thank Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the premier sponsor of the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. We greatly appreciate their partnership during the past 4 years as premier sponsor of this impactful event. And HPM Corporation is a silver sponsor of the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit, and we appreciate their support too. And now to this morning's first session, the DEI Toolkit Workshop. Our presenter this morning is Sharee Adkins, Executive Director of the Northwest Credit Union Foundation. Now, Sharee, I want to give a brief introduction of you because you've got some impressive skill sets here. We've got some connections on your education. So you hold a bachelor's degree in sociology from Boise State University and a master's degree in organizational leadership from the University of Idaho. That's where we have some things in common, the organizational leadership. Awesome. Sharee leads the Northwest Credit Union Foundation after 15 years leading fundraising efforts and implementing large-scale initiatives at public and nonprofit organizations in Idaho and Washington. Sharee, welcome. We are thrilled to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So over to you. This is your show now.
Wonderful, thank you. And I will take just one moment to make sure I am sharing my screen before I jump in. All right, so thank you so very much for having me here today. I'm excited. It's really, really wonderful to see the work that you all are doing and to be a part of this. And Shay, so excited to see you as well again. And I just, before we dive in on the DEI Task Force, Credit Union Task Force recommendations document, which is the toolkit that we'll be talking about, I want to spend a minute and talk about the Northwest Credit Union Foundation and sort of set context for how all of this work came about. So the Northwest Credit Union Foundation that I lead, it's an organization that works hand in hand with credit unions across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And that's about 170 credit unions that we partner with. And our mission, we are powered by a network of credit unions, and we're uniquely positioned to harness and deliver resources that strengthen the financial lives of people and communities across the region. So we work with credit unions around things like workforce housing, so provide grants to credit unions and partner with them on projects with pilot initiatives, on all things workforce housing. And that's not just in, one community like Seattle, it's across the region, in Eastern Idaho and Northern Idaho, Southern Oregon, and, all the way up to Bellingham. We have partnerships with credit unions to impact workforce housing across the region. That was our first large initiative a number of years ago. Since that time, we've had this pandemic. We did a lot in partnership with credit unions to serve their communities throughout the pandemic, help people, ITIN borrowers, so those are borrowers who don't have Social Security numbers, and then also low-wage workers who were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And then more recently, we've launched this year an initiative focused on providing access or ensuring access to financial services in rural communities, and just ensuring that the people, the small businesses, the economy in rural communities can thrive with the support of credit unions. When we talk about credit unions, just really quickly want to set some additional context. So what are credit unions? Credit unions are not-for-profit financial institutions. They're cooperatively owned by their members. We have millions and millions of members across Oregon and Washington and Idaho. And I imagine many of you are credit union members as well and utilize credit unions as your primary financial institution. And credit unions have this long history of people helping people. They were founded, when you think about a credit union, an individual credit union's history, it often has an origin story that goes back to, teachers that came together and said, we want to be able to help each other out. So we're going to pool our resources so that we can lend to one another. And you think about BCUs, one of the largest credit unions in the country. That was Boeing employees coming together so that they could lend each other money so that they could purchase tools and get to work. So when you think about the origins of credit unions, it really is this people helping people, people coming together to support one another so that they can achieve their financial dreams. And that has been the case with credit unions across our country and the world for a very long time. And it really is at the association. So our foundation that I lead, we're part of this trade association family that supports credit unions across the region, those same 170 some credit unions. And the association and foundation, we partner together on a lot of work and really see credit unions pushing for the principles of inclusion, for diversity, for equity, and have been sort of convening conversations around that work for some time. So then that leads us to the task force work. So it was middle of last year when we started to really have deep conversations with credit unions about what credit unions could do collectively to come together in support of DEI efforts. And that really started with credit unions, honestly, from across all three states, from unlikely places across all three states. And it was really important for us as credit unions came together to look at, what is it that we can do, and this is part of the credit union philosophy, when we work together towards something. So that from there emerged a task force, which, I think we've probably all been parts of task forces. This was a really good one. The folks that showed up for this task force were committed. They were all in. It was hard work. It took months and months of work of coming together to produce the recommendations document that was produced, but it was really just a genuine effort from folks across the region who had a sincere interest in seeing this work happen. So the task force's charter, they were really looking at how they could discover, review, and discuss the best DEI related tools, practices, and resources available. And I think one of the things that's important to note about this is that when the task force came together, it was really with this focus on what actions can we take. We'd had these conversations about why DEI is important, but really wanted to move to a place where we said, okay, but then how, if I take this back into my shop and implement it, how can I move the needle? How can I move the work forward? So focus very much on actionable recommendations for credit unions, and regardless of where they are in that journey. So we also looked at, how do you boil this ocean? How do you start? And so for us, for credit unions, it made sense for us to sort of organize our work into three categories. That task force broke into, at one point, subgroups that did work as credit unions as employers, credit unions as financial institutions, and then credit unions as community partners, and really looked deeply at those three sort of subgroups and what could be done. So when I said it was credit unions from across the region, I do want to take a minute and really spend some time talking about how that group came together, because I think as you're looking at how you might come together with others to develop and implement actionable DEI steps, I think there's a good story here in how these credit unions came together. So you see on the screen, it's, logo soup. But the point of sharing all of these is really just to demonstrate. So in the credit union space, there are credit unions that are larger, like BCU, and there are credit unions that are smaller. So when I compare it to, restaurants in the Tri-Cities, you may have a small business owner who owns one restaurant, and you may have a small business owner who owns multiple restaurants, a chain of restaurants that are local to the Tri-Cities. the needs for that restaurant that has 8 chains or 15 chain restaurants in the Tri-Cities are different, although similar, but different from that restaurant owner who just has the one. So it was really important for us to look across our 170 some credit unions and say, do we have a good representation of credit unions from different asset sizes, to make sure we've got those different perspectives. We also looked regionally. So when I was talking earlier about the foundation grants being, all over the 3 states, this was really, we looked at, what's going on in Spokane, what's going on in Boise and Eastern Idaho, Medford, Eugene, up in Bellingham, all of Tri-Cities, all of the places across the 3 states, and said, what voices can we bring to this table from across those regions that bring a really unique perspective? How do we make sure there are rural voices in this conversation, and urban and suburban, everything in between? But we also looked within those credit unions at, who from within the organization can we bring to the conversation? And that was really important. So we had folks at the table who were CEOs. We had folks at the table who were the VP of lending. We had HR folks, but we also had, I think from a knowledge of DEI practices, there were for sure people who were on the task force whose job it was to do DEI work in an organization, right? So it was the director of DEI at a credit union. But we also had folks at the table who were just learning really what DEI stood for, what it meant, how it impacted their business and how it impacted the way they did their daily operations. So we tried to make sure that there was this diversity of perspective, and just acknowledging that folks are at different places in their DEI journey, like widely different places in their DEI journey, and that's good and okay. And let's bring all of those perspectives to the table to make sure that we're not leaving any of those out. So, I don't want to belabor it, but it was a really important part of the process for us when we were developing the task force to make sure that the folks that we brought to the table really did, represent the entire region and represent everything that it is to be a credit union, so that we didn't have any blind spots. So next, I want to talk a bit about the journey that we took the task force on. So task forces are typically time limited. They don't exist in perpetuity. And that was the case with this task force. It came together for a really specific purpose, that charter that you saw before. And then, it was important for us because it was time bound to make sure that we went through a really intentional process. We brought in a third-party facilitator who helped us navigate conversations, helped us set the context. Again, boiling the ocean, we did identify those 3 work groups within the task force, but it was still, I think a lot of how do you start having these conversations? So setting that context. We had really important and valuable conversations around our norms for the group, our agreements for the group, making commitments to one another. We had about 30 folks who were part of this task force. It was really important that we all be on the same page and show up with respect for one another, be able to engage in challenging dialogue in a way, that moved the work forward. So we absolutely set those agreements on the front end and continually brought them up as we moved through the task force's work. We set context in terms of the time that we're in, and then the history of credit unions, the history of racial injustice across the region, and really tried to make sure that we were starting from that place of context. Then we took the group through activities, and that facilitator that we worked with was really helpful in taking the group through these activities, because it can be a lot, but exploring both strengths and opportunities, right? Looking at, where are there areas where we know that we can do more, which I think all of us can look at any of our businesses and say, we can do more in these areas, right? So really doing a lot of work there with the task force, asking those task force members to go back to their credit unions and get information, asking them to go back and do research and bring that forward, and then coming back together and sharing it out. And that was that phase of looking at strengths, looking at opportunities. That took a couple of months of really deep dive. And that, again, tried to break it into credit unions as employers, as financial institutions, and as community partners so that we could, try to, I think, break up, divide the work between everybody on the task force. And then from there, we really, the facilitator helped us walk through, okay, what did we uncover from that work? Where were there some themes? What emerged from the conversations? And then how do we then take that and develop it into actionable recommendations? So important considerations throughout all of this that we talked about a lot with the task force, and that, I think it's important to share here. First and foremost, and it's, not necessarily on this slide, but none of the folks that were part of the task force were experts. We didn't bring in a third party expert to say, here's what you credit unions need to be doing. It was organic, and it was developed by all of the folks on the task force working together. So I think that's important to note. Also, I think all of us know DEI is a non-linear journey, right? So there is no place that everybody starts and everybody finishes. It is not work that ends. It is work that's ongoing, and it looks different depending on your organization. Even within the credit union industry, for different credit unions, it looks different. So then, looking at your businesses, how does it make sense in the context of your business? That was an important conversation as we went through the task force. Next, I think I mentioned this before as well. The recommendations are really focused on actionable steps for credit unions. And I think, one of the things that we got a lot of before the task force was these great conversations, phone calls from folks who would say, okay, we really are committed to this, and we're struggling with this piece. Where do we start on this? Do you have resources? Can you help us learn from another credit union that's been down this road, or for another organization that's been down this road, and can sort of show us, this is what we did, and see what we can take and make our own. So that actionable piece, I think, was a really, really important part of the task force's work. And then this was really important too, that those recommendations, they were crafted so that any credit union, regardless of where they were in their journey, could implement the pieces that made sense for them. So when you look at those task force recommendations as a whole, it was never the expectation that a credit union take that document and use it as a roadmap and say, okay, I'm starting with recommendation 1, and then I'll do recommendation 2, and then I'll do 3. That's not the way that the recommendations were crafted. It really was meant to be this resource, this toolkit, so that credit unions, organizations could look at it and say, we can start here. We're going to take this recommendation, implement it in our organization, see what it looks like, and then we'll take the next step. Those important. And then some additional context. I think I already shared, very diverse group of Northwest credit unions represented. Any credit union can utilize. And I think, this gets to the work never being done. It's a continually evolving space, right? With new resources and opportunities emerging. So while we've created this recommendations document and credit unions are utilizing this, we also, connected to this, have a resource library that we're continually updating. So when we see things out in the credit union industry across the country, or from other industries where we say, oh, this would be really helpful for credit unions, we're bringing those resources in and sharing them through a resource library that is connected to the recommendations document. Because we know this space is continually evolving and will continue to, and we hope it does, right? So let's keep learning and leaning in and seeing what opportunities exist to do more. So again, keeping the content and resources focused on action. So those are some of the contextual pieces. I also want to share just this. You probably have seen this before, but this was really helpful as the task force was going through its work in terms of how we define diversity. We really wanted to make sure we weren't only focusing on visible diversity, or only focusing on diversity as it relates to race and ethnicity, we wanted to look at this whole spectrum and acknowledge that, as credit unions are serving their members and their communities, that these are the things that make up this multifaceted and complex community that they're supporting. And so what does that mean as a credit union that's looking at supporting a community and engaging with their credit union members, from that perspective. So we just wanted to share this because this is sort of how we looked at all of the aspects of diversity. So then when we got to the actual recommendations, so there were absolutely clear themes across the recommendations that came out of those conversations. Imagine that would be true for any of you that sat down and engaged in this work yourself. And those themes, data, vision, and commitment, are all really interconnected. The first, data, is about using the information that you have available and going and gathering information to help you understand the context that you're operating in. What does a community look like? What's the history of your organization in the context of your community? And what does your employee base look like? What does your board look like? All of those data points, when you're starting on this journey, start from an informed place, right? And so that was a really key part of this, was utilizing a very data-driven approach, and you'll see that in the recommendations in specific sections as well. So the next is articulating a clear DEI vision that's unique for us to each credit union, and that embodies that people helping people philosophy. I think it's really important as an organization takes this work on to have that vision, to really understand, a clear why to what your organization is doing. And then the next, commitment. Before you engage in this work, really ensure that you have that commitment, prioritizing the work in your organization. And again, in the context of your organization's history, in the context of the customers that you serve, and all of that. So those were overarching, and you'll see them sort of pull out a bit in these specific recommendations. Now I'm going to dive into the specific recommendations themselves. And I do want to share, so, obviously this is credit union focused because that's the world that we've been operating in and who these recommendations were drafted for. But I hope as we go through this, you'll see these recommendations are pretty darn applicable regardless of the industry that you're in, regardless of your business and what you do. There are some in the credit unions as financial institutions category that I think you could still, pull from, but that might be a little bit more of a stretch. But we all are employers, right? So as employers, what are those things that we can do? And the things that came out specifically from that work: conduct organizational benchmarking with data and leadership education. And this goes back to that overarching piece about data, right? So really understand your employees and start from there before you start rolling out DEI training, before you start engaging with your employees around different things. Get a sense for who your employees are and what they care about, how they feel about the work, and whether they feel a sense of belonging, all of those pieces. The next recommendation is to commit and support staff time. There's a lot of conversation in the task force about this, particularly as it relates to smaller organizations. So how do you, when you have a smaller organization, a small business, and it's, you're wearing 15 different hats, and being the DEI person might be one of those hats. It really is about how do you articulate in a job description? How do you make sure there's compensation associated with staff time that goes toward these efforts, so that it really is, it is built into the expectation of your team that this work is a priority. The next is around developing employee resource groups, or we talked about cross-functional teams as well. So in a small company, a small organization, it might not make sense to develop an employee resource group, but there might be other unique, interesting ways that you could do cross-functional teams so that you can develop an appreciation, a sense of belonging across the team. So what is an employee resource group? That really is, when you think about trying to think, there's a credit union in Washington that does this really well. And they have a number of employee resource groups. And one of them is for Latinx employees at their credit union. And they get together and, have conversations about their sense of belonging and what they can do to celebrate different parts of their culture with the organization. And it's a great relationship between that employee resource group and the rest of the credit union. There are often LGBTQ plus employee resource groups, and really just thinking about all the different people that make up your organization, giving them the opportunity to come together and feel that sense of belonging. So. And then fostering cultural competency, really. So, what can credit unions, what can businesses do to ensure that across their team, not just outward facing, but across their team, everybody on their team has a strong cultural competency. And what does that look like from a training perspective? So those are the first 4 recommendations for credit unions as employers. And now I will say this section was where the majority of the recommendations came out. So the next is to analyze hiring and promotional policies and practices. And, oftentimes this work does engage outside consultants who can look at your practices and policies with fresh eyes and with a different perspective from what you've always been doing. But it's important work when you're looking at those hiring and promotion practices, looking for unintentional bias or bias that you're unaware of that you've built into those processes. There's some really, really great work out there that helps organizations overcome some of those biases. And so that recommendation was a really interesting conversation as we were going through that work with the task force. The next, proactively connecting employees from historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. And that really, that piece was just, again, back to that sense of belonging. That came up so much in the task force's conversations. How do we as organizations create a sense of belonging in our organization for our employees, right? And particularly for those employees who've been historically marginalized. The next, engage managers and recruiters in DEI training. And so this is different a bit from, just training the whole team. How do you specifically work with your managers, with your recruiters to make sure they have DEI training that makes it so that they are the very best managers, the very best recruiters in the context of being a very culturally aware and culturally responsive organization. And then finally, attract, recruit, and invite talent pool that reflects your membership, credit union membership, and market. And so that, I think that piece is often one that you see kind of in the news a bit more about, does an organization's executive leadership team reflect the community that it serves, or does the board reflect the community that it serves? So really looking at how your business can attract, recruit, and invite talent that really does reflect your customers and that reflects the markets that you serve. So those were the recommendations for credit unions as employers. And I will, if it hasn't been done already by the wonderful Tri-City Regional Commerce or Chamber of Commerce team, I will drop a link to the task force recommendations document in the chat when I'm done. And that goes into, I think some pretty specific steps. These are all just kind of the highlights, but that gives you, that document will give you the opportunity to really dive in on what the task force meant with each of these. So then moving into credit unions as financial institutions. So credit unions offer a lot to their members, right? So checking accounts and savings accounts, mortgages, auto loans, home equity lines of credit, things like that, right? So all of those things in the context of credit unions being these not-for-profit, community-based financial institutions, what could credit unions do through this DEI lens? And so some key things came out. First, invest time in researching and understanding the specific demographics of your community through a data lens. Again, that sort of data piece coming out in this specific recommendation. And this is, so that you can, I think, identify and better develop products and services that make sense in the context of the communities that you serve. The next, conduct a DEI audit to establish baselines, benchmarks, long-term goals aligned with the DEI vision. And that really comes down to, how do credit unions as these organizations from the top and all the way through the organization as they're developing products and services, understand kind of where they are and where they need to be. So it's connected to the data, but it's more around organizing themselves internally to make sure they have organizational readiness to be able to move in this direction. The next, develop inclusive and equitable product design processes and products and services. And that, I think there's a lot in there for any of our businesses as we look to engage in this DEI work. How do we develop inclusive and equitable product design and processes? How do we as a business make sure that we're looking at how we serve our customers and our community through this lens? And oftentimes I think this work does also require, bringing an outside perspective in, because you've got fresh eyes looking at that work in a different way to help inform how you could do it differently moving forward. And then the last one, and I think this is one that's absolutely something that could be beneficial across any business, is adopting specific strategies to increase supplier diversity. And that I will say in a recent conversation with a credit union, they really took a long look at all of their vendors. They looked at all of their business partners through that lens. And, there are, we're about to talk about the community partner section. There are a lot of ways that you can sort of impact this, how you engage with like BIPOC owned businesses and things like that. And this is a really, I think, an opportunity for businesses to just take a minute and look and say, are there ways that we can be better about how we support BIPOC owned businesses or support underrepresented communities in this different way? Oftentimes we think about how we support a nonprofit, right? But that vendor diversity is a really important thing as well. Sorry, I'm losing my voice all of a sudden. Okay, so then the last section that we talked about, credit unions as community partners. And I think that this one is one that should especially resonate with any business, regardless of the business you do. And they're in the Tri-Cities area, all of the work that you do, as community members and showing up every day as a business owner, but then also, as a community partner. So we developed 3 recommendations. The task force developed 3 recommendations in this space. The first was really understanding the important issues impacting your community. And when I think about Tri-Cities area and all of the opportunities that businesses have to engage, with the nonprofits in the region and to understand just what are those issues around housing and healthcare and food insecurity and all those other things that are impacting your community. Who are you reaching out to? Where are you showing up to learn about what's going on in your community so that you can really understand how those issues are impacting your customers, impacting the communities that you serve as a business? So spend time doing that work. And it was really interesting conversation just to hear, credit unions are fantastic community partners, spend a lot of time in the community, working to understand the community and to serve the community. And there was such a robust conversation with the credit unions on the task force about how, it takes time to build trust and to understand those issues. They're complex issues. When we talk about housing, just housing alone, and think about, folks along that continuum of housing, everything from people who are experiencing homelessness and sleeping on the streets, all the way, and I clearly work in financial services, but all the way to like market rate mortgages, market rate rentals, and everything in between, to talk about housing and how it impacts your region, that's not an easy conversation to have. But how does your business engage with those in the community that are tackling that work? And how do you get more informed about who's being disproportionately impacted by the things that are changing in your community or have historically been disproportionately impacted? And then that will help you as a business figure out where you want to plug in. So then the next one, make a commitment to deep and sustained engagement. And I think this one, I come from the nonprofit space. I run a foundation, so I'm now on the sort of the philanthropic side of that. equation, but making a commitment to deep and sustained engagement can be challenging, but it's such an important part of the work. Now, nonprofits across your region have fundraisers, have galas. Please keep showing up for those things. But are there opportunities for your business to show up differently than just being the gala sponsor? How do you take that gala sponsorship conversation and turn it into something that is a deep and meaningful conversation with those community-based organizations, those nonprofits that are doing that work? Because I think when you do that, you uncover all of these other ways that your organization can show up in partnership with those community-based organizations that just create such a richer opportunity, so much more complex and sustained and I think impactful when you do that. So that one I think is and it's something that credit unions do really well, in my opinion, from what I have seen in partnering with credit unions and the way they support their communities. But know that it's something that all of us could do, more around in developing those deeper relationships with the community-based organizations in our region. So. And then that last one, investing the time and resources in community organizations. And, think about the community I live in. I live in Oregon. I live in a somewhat small town in Oregon. And I think about the pandemic and how the coffee shop owner and the dance studio owner and all of these other people in our community really came together and invested not just their dollars, but their time at a time when things were really hard for them, but invested into our community to make sure our community was able to pull through the pandemic during the hardest times. And that investment of time and resources as a small business owner or a business owner at all, I know can be really, really challenging because you're already, working so hard to keep your business moving forward, especially during the pandemic, and to grow and to take care of your employees. But that investment of time and resources into community organizations, I think there's such a return on that investment that comes from that deeper, more meaningful engagement. So this area, credit unions as community partners, or really any of us as community partners, is one that I'm really passionate about because I think it really is what makes community our community such a wonderful place, and does create the sense of belonging for folks and deeper, more meaningful impact when we partner. So those are the recommendations for credit unions as community partners. So let me take a quick step back and just say, credit unions from the task force, they came together, they did all of this work to sort of analyze, make sense of the strengths and opportunities, and then from there sort of sift it out and say, okay, how do we categorize this? We're going to group it as credit unions as employers, credit unions as financial institutions, and then credit unions as community partners. It was a good way for us to sort of organize the work streams too, from that task force. And then from there, they did another sort of layer of analysis. Those subgroups spent a lot of time looking at, what does this mean for us? How do we articulate it? How is this recommendation different from that recommendation? And then, like I said, they took the time with each of those recommendations to go out and say, are there resources that exist out there that would be beneficial for this specific recommendation? So we developed a resource library that went along with each recommendation. So credit unions in our membership, the association's membership, can access that, where they can say, okay, well, we're taking a deep dive on this recommendation 8. So what resources exist out there? Are there toolkits? Are there other credit unions that have done something similar? What can we inform ourselves with before we engage in this work? So that was really important for them to break out those work streams, I think, and take those sort of deeper dives. And that's how we got to this place where we have these 3 areas of recommendation. All right. So that was really, I think, the bulk of what the recommendations produced. I want to share just a little bit more before I let all of you go, but it was the task force, after the recommendations document came out, we've taken opportunities, I think, to really build on the recommendations. So while the task force's work was officially done after the recommendations document was produced. The actual work has just begun, really. So now we're taking the recommendations and doing deep dives into, very specific recommendations. We're bringing specific credit unions in and saying, like we had our annual convention in October. And we were able to bring 3 different credit unions from our region together and just have them sit down, and each of them took one recommendation and said, this is how we've implemented it in our shop. This is what it looked like. Here were the challenges we faced. Here's how we did it slightly differently. Here's what we'd recommend if you tried to take this recommendation and implement it in your shop. Some considerations around how it went, what it looks like now because we've done that work. And they really have sort of brought that work to life. So I would recommend that if you're, engaging in this work in your own industry or with a group in your community and trying to get to a place where you have the sort of set of actionable recommendations, that you not let that be where the work ends, so to speak, because it really is just the beginning. I appreciate very much your chamber for bringing this conversation forward, because it's exactly what I'm talking about, where, how do you continue to make this conversation important? How do you continue to bring this conversation to the forefront? And with the recommendations, how can we take each of those recommendations and say, all right, how do we make this one especially actionable? How do we build out all of the other pieces that go along with that? So I'm excited for, we just released the task force recommendations, gosh, maybe 3 months ago. So it hasn't been out in the world that long, but we've already been able to take so much from those recommendations and create content that's meaningful and helpful, and that helps credit unions build internally on their individual DEI journeys. So it's been really remarkable to be a part of it. And we're just getting started. So I'm really excited for what we'll be able to do from here forward. If I had any sort of parting advice for you as you engage in this work, it really is, that it is a nonlinear journey. And I'm so excited that you're here, because I think that means you're committed to, regardless of where you are in that journey, you're committed to doing the work. So it is, just dive in with something and make that sort of action happen. And I think there's a lot of conversation that happens around DEI, which is good. But then we've got to follow it up with action. We've got to follow it up with how we change in our organizations and our businesses. So really excited to be sharing that with you. And thank you very much for your time today. And I'll turn it back over to Shay.
Sharee, oh my gosh. Thank you so much for presenting this fabulous DEI toolkit example. What resonated with me was when you said that DEI is a nonlinear journey, that you look at DEI from all angles of the work that you do. And then you use the word cultural competency, and that resonated with me as well. So many great nuggets. I hope that everyone listening in, or folks who might be watching this and stream this later on, can use some of these best practices in their own workplace. You talked about not just, having the conversation and having this print out of a toolkit, but actually taking action on it. And so that's what we look forward to, those opportunities for the folks who get to watch this and get to benefit from this great information, that they have the direction and that they also take action on it. So thank you, Sharee, so very much. Yeah. For those of you listening in, don't go anywhere. Our next listening session begins at 11:15. In the CEO Roundtable listening session, we're going to hear from 4 local CEO panelists, the leaders of Greater Columbia Accountable Community of Health, HAPO Community Credit Union, which you'd be familiar with, Sharee, New Edge, and Carbotex. They're going to talk about best DEI practices from their business perspectives. And don't forget, the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit keynote presentation is tomorrow at noon. Keynote speaker Kuma Roberts will give you 5 quick wins to supercharge your business strategy for inclusion. Kuma is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant with over 10 years of organizational development experience, specializing in the business case for DEI, cultural competence, implicit bias, and more. And also, we will honor the recipients of the 2021 Tri-Cities Champion of Diversity Awards. You're not going to want to miss it. So go ahead and register at the link in the Zoom Q&A tab if you haven't already. I'm sure that all the folks who are watching today have already registered for it, but just in case there are a few who haven't, make sure that you register so that you can save your virtual seat. And of course, all sessions from the Tri-Cities Diversity Summit will be posted on the Chamber's YouTube channel, Facebook page, and on tricityregionalchamber.com. We'll also email the links out to all of today's attendees. So please feel free to share these videos with your friends, family, and your colleagues who may have missed it. Thank you to all the sponsors of this year's Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. Our premier sponsor, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Gold sponsors, Greater Columbia Accountable Community of Health and HAPO Community Credit Union. Our silver sponsors, Christensen Inc., Columbia Basin College, Energy Northwest, HPM Corporation, and CALAC. Of course, our bronze sponsors, Bechtel National Inc., BNSF Railway, Carbotex, Redder and Company, Sotheby's International Realty, and Washington State University Tri-Cities. So again, we appreciate you joining us this morning. Sharee, again, fantastic job. Thank you for the toolkit. Sit tight, and we'll be back for our next session, which is at 11:15 sharp. Thank you guys so much for joining us today.